Shadow Hack. Chapter 491 Unreasonable Yuan Biyao. Gradually the elders discovered that something abnormal was going on. The cultivation of the independent flux point shouldn't take so much time because it was completely different from the previous two main points. The naval flux point was an independently working, extremely gentle as well as innately opened flux point. That was why the origin god world hadn't arranged 8 energy balls to attack Flux Point in the Holy Land of Naval Star Point. Instead, they didn't hesitate to use the gentle energy of the Sea Devil Beast's core. With this, the Naval Star Point could be cultivated, and they would also conveniently assist people in curing their hidden injuries from cultivating the previous 2 Flux Points. Yes, it is a little abnormal. Under ordinary circumstances, as long as a cultivator remains immersed within the gentle energy of the core for 3 hours, they will be forced out. But this person has been inside for more than 12 hours. Moreover, the 2 guards paused and simultaneously looked at Yuan Biyao. Moreover what? Speak quickly, don't hum and haw. What sort of person is Biyao princess? Since you both are acting in professional manner, why would she bother you? One of the 3 elders said with a gloomy expression. Yuan Biyao opened her mouth to say something, but in the end just snorted coldly. After receiving the support of the elder, one of the guards told all the details he knew. According to the previous discreet inquiries made by this subordinate, the time required by this person to cultivate the previous 2 flux points was an exact opposite. He only needed a day and a night to finish cultivating them. When the elders heard it, their eyes shone brightly. Cultivating 2 main points within less than 2 days? And the time required to cultivate the naval star point which was naturally open took him 4 times that of regular people? Even now, he was still staying there. What sort of people were the elders? Just based on the difference in the circumstances of Li Yunmu and other cultivators while cultivating the final 3 flux points, they confirmed some guesses and looked at each other while slowly counting the time in their hearts. When 15 hours passed since Li Yunmu had entered the core rotating in midair, it finally slowed down and stopped. Li Yunmu was sent out by the power of the core's spell formation. Li Yunmu, immediately follow me to the ancient Devil Mountain. No one had expected that once Li Yunmu appeared, Yuan Biyao would actually renege on her deal and without giving any opportunity to the 3 elders would walk away while pulling Li Yunmu with her. By then, he had reached the great circle of 108 flux points, and his strength had underwent an even greater transformation, but he still hadn't digested all his gains. At that moment, he was faced with the elders of Origin God Sect as well as Yuan Biyao while the guards stood a few steps back. He was still somewhat unclear about the situation, but Yuan Biyao's voice echoed in his ear the next moment. Listen to me, if you don't want to catch the eye of Origin God Sect, obediently follow me. Immediately, Li Yunmu, who was about to break away from her hold, halted his resistive actions. Although he didn't like this crazy woman Yuan Biyao, he wasn't an idiot. He was extremely clear that even if she kept repeating over and over that she would take her revenge against him, in the end, she wasn't a threat to him. At most, she planned to really lock him in the Origin God world. But if he caught the attention of Origin God Sect? This was definitely worth thinking over. Perhaps he had some value and could receive an important position in Origin God Sect. But it was definite that that importance would be based on how much they could exploit him. Thus, Li Yunmu nodded without any hesitation and secretly glanced at the 3 elders of Origin God Sect before following behind Yuan Biyao. This one glance left Li Yunmu greatly astonished. As he had expected, the elders of Origin God Sect were all sage flux experts. Li Yunmu only glanced at them once, but he felt a formless pressure coming from them. Surprisingly, this pressure wasn't the least bit inferior to that of Battle Sage and Jing. Yet the 3 elder-grade powerhouses were casually sent by Origin God Sect? This sort of strength was a little too terrifying. According to what he knew, the position of an elder in the Origin God Sect wasn't as high as he had imagined because there were just too many people who had reached it. He couldn't imagine how just one origin god sect could have more quasi-deities than the entire earth. How enormously powerful was a first-tier sect. Li Yunmu was actually quite anxious in his heart. His earth strength was insignificant compared to a single first-tier power of the origin world. Your Highness, you cannot do this. Just a moment ago, you agreed to allow us to investigate this youngster. Otherwise, how would we have the face to report back to Sect Master? One of the elders of the origin god sect couldn't help but intervene. Yuan Biyao became completely unreasonable at that moment and said, I agreed that you all can observe the situation. The time during which you observed him wasn't short by any means. Now, you all have collected sufficient information from your investigation to report to your sect master, so now I'm taking him to see Ancestor Yuan. Do you have any objections to that? When the elders of Origin God sect heard the words Ancestor Yuan, their complexions changed instantly. They had been prepared to engage her in word battle, but now all the words were stuck in their throats. They didn't dare to keep Li Yunmu behind with force. They watching him leave as if trying to etch his face in their memories. At that moment, Li Yunmu was having a big headache. He couldn't make any sense of the situation. He had only cultivated for a few days, so how could he attract the attention of the upper echelons of Origin God sect? According to what he heard, he had even alarmed the sect master. However, Li Yunmu didn't think much about it. In any case, his situation could no longer get worse. If it was to do that, what could possibly happen? He had reached the great circle in one breath. After thinking about it, he breathed a sigh of relief. Regardless of whatever happened, the important thing was that his strength had increased. As long as he entered seclusion for a time and congealed the armor of a great flux expert, he could return to Earth soon. As for how he would leave the origin god world? At that thought, Li Yunmu subconsciously looked at Yuan Biyao, who was walking in front of him. Apparently, whether he could return or not completely depended on this crazy woman. Why are you looking at me like that? Yuan Biyao had pulled on Li Yunmu to hurry after her, and only after they disappeared from the vision of the three elders did she stop doing that. Nothing. I wonder, why is the upper echelon of Origin God sect paying attention to a minor character like me? Who is Ancestor Yuan? Could he be the oldest person of your Yuan clan? Li Yunmu shook his head and blurted out without thinking everything on his mind. Once Yuan Biyao heard him, she immediately spoke with an angry smile. Seems like you still don't know what you did? When you were attacking the chest C and abdomen C points, where did all the energy you absorbed go? Chapter 492 Leaving the World. What do you mean, where did it go? Obviously it was poured into my flux point. Li Yunmu was dumbfounded. Even now, he still didn't understand the situation completely. Soon, the two of them along with Yuan Biao's personal maid Ying Ying entered the woods in the night. At the foot of the ancestor tree, there was a two-headed giant salamander at the head of a luxurious chariot waiting for them. When Li Yunmu saw Yuan Biyao drag him to the beast chariot, he couldn't help but ask, are you really taking me to see the ancestor of your Yuan clan? Are you truly an idiot or just faking stupidity? If I hadn't mentioned the name of that old man, how could those elders let you leave so easily? Yuan Biyao rolled her eyes at Li Yunmu. After that, the two of them rode in the chariot silently. While sitting still, Li Yunmu could sense that they were galloping at an unimaginable speed. Ying Ying, who was driving the chariot, was issuing continuous commands in a melodious voice in an intermittent manner. After being berated by her, the two-headed salamander began to rush with even more speed. During the journey, Li Yunmu felt a strange urgency, as if Yuan Biyao was fighting with time. After a long time, she finally spoke. Stay here. Don't ask anything, and also don't try to resist the beast chariot's protective shield. After you return to the origin world, immediately return to Underworld Serpent. As long as you go back, Origin God sect won't take the large risk to capture you. What, are you actually going to release me? Don't you hate me? Don't you want to take revenge against me? Besides, what exactly did I do that even alarmed the Origin God sect to the point that they insist on capturing me? Li Yunmu didn't understand anything. But he knew that the crazy woman before him was doing another crazy thing at that moment. Surprisingly though, for him, no, probably for the person whose image was still etched in her heart, she had dared to fight against Origin God sect. Although Li Yunmu understood the status of a person from Yuan clan in this world, she would still have to pay an extremely high price. Who knew whether she could survive paying it or not? Don't ask many questions or I might change my mind. While facing Li Yunmu's ever-present curiosity, Yuan Biyao was extremely gloomy. She had never thought that someone against whom she wanted to take revenge by trapping him in her world would instead take advantage of the situation and draw her to clear his mess. Seeing the other party's ugly complexion, Li Yunmu nodded. He also didn't want to attract more trouble for himself, but in the end, he still said one sentence out of goodwill, "Fine, but you're acting in such a presumptuous manner. Are you sure it'll be all right?" Yingying joined their conversation at that moment. Her melodious voice echoed from outside the chariot. "You only need to think about yourself. It is still unknown whether you can escape from the Origin God world or not. It truly is a big trouble, princess. People from Origin God sect are already chasing us." From the beginning, Li Yunmu had an extremely odd feeling regarding her. The vague presence from her made him feel like she didn't look her true age. Yingying's presence was surprisingly similar to the little shadow ancestor which he had brought up previously. Could it be then that she wasn't a human? "Yingying, deal with them." Yuan Biao's body tensed up. Although she belonged to the upper echelons of Origin God world, she couldn't help but get nervous when she heard that the people of Origin God sect were chasing her. After all, even after spending the last month in seclusion at the 12th layer of Origin God sect, her personal strength was barely able to keep up with that of Li Yunmu. In fact, in terms of combat prowess, even 10 Yuan Biaos wouldn't necessarily be an opponent for Li Yunmu. The reason for that was that after Li Yunmu had cultivated all the 108 flux points and reached the Great Circle, his strength had reached a heaven-shaking level, far surpassing the strength of cultivators on the same level. Although Li Yunmu didn't understand why exactly he'd caught the gaze of Origin God sect to the point that they wanted to capture him, he could guess a number of things. Apparently, the source of his trouble was his cultivation of the final 3 flux points, which caused Origin God sect to treat him with great importance. "Alright, take care, I've wanted to have a battle with these ascetics for a while." Soon, a chilly but melodious voice came from outside the beast chariot. Li Yunmu raised his ears and made all effort to peep on the actions of Yingying, who could battle against the high-level cultivators from the sect. However, despite everything, he could only hear rustling sounds together with the muffled noise of something snapping. It was hard for him to sense anyone's movements. But according to what he knew, the ascetics of the Origin God world were affiliated to the ascetic courtyard of Origin God sect. Each of them possessed extreme loyalty toward the sect, and the weakest of them had the strength of mid-great flux expert. In other words, each of the people behind them possessed deep and unmeasurable strength. If they were compared with the fluxers of Earth, then the strength possessed by each one would be close to a domain sage powerhouse. Clearly, the Origin God sect had many apprehensions regarding Yuan Biao's existence, which is why it hadn't dispatched more powerful pursuers. However, regardless of whether it was Yuan Biao or Li Yunmu, even one ascetic would be an extremely powerful opponent to them. What a pity! If only I'd had some time to congeal Great Flux Expert's battle armor and succeeded in increasing my cultivation, then given my abilities, these ascetics might not have had an upper hand in battle against me. Li Yunmu sighed inwardly. He had to accept that in the time he spent in the Origin God world, his harvests were enormous. His cultivation had increased by leaps and bounds, especially after cultivating all the 108 flux points and reaching Great Circle. Once his cultivation upgraded, his starting point would have far surpassed all the great flux experts at the same realm, and this was not even counting the combined strength of the 11 shadows. And Li Yunmu wasn't just shooting his mouth. Based on Earth's cultivation system, his strength had already increased by a few realms. After a long while, Ying Ying's voice came from outside. "All right, they've been stopped. Princess, quickly go to the entrance." For the benefit of the entire Origin God world, Ying Ying has to stop the beast chariot. But whether it was an illusion or reality, Li Yunmu felt that Ying Ying's voice wasn't sharp and clear like before. It sounded rather hoarse and exhausted. But she seemed to be quite excited. Apparently in the battle which he couldn't sense, the little girl Ying Ying had beaten the ascetics. And it wasn't just 1 or 2, but at least 7 or more. Instantly, Li Yunmu's curiosity toward Ying Ying shot sky high. What sort of existence was she? And what sort of reassurance did Yuan Biyao have that she dared to fight against Origin God sect? Chapter 493 Trapped Dragon is Freed. Suddenly, Li Yunmu had a vague feeling that Yuan Biao's identity wasn't as simple as that of the princess of Yuan imperial clan. Otherwise, even if the influence of Yuan clan's princess or emperor was enormous, it shouldn't be of such high importance to Origin God sect. "All right, start the shield," Yuan Biyao expressionlessly said. After that, Li Yunmu discovered that he couldn't sense anything from the outside. At that moment, the inside of the beast chariot had been transformed into an independent sealed world. This is the juice of world ancestors' leaves which he wanted. It is enough for 5 people. Take it and leave. Yuan Biyao took out a thumb-sized transparent bottle inside which a green-colored liquid was flickering. It was the leaf juice of the ancestor tree which Li Yunmu had tried to acquire using every possible means ever since he had entered the Origin God world. However, he had quickly discovered that although he could stand upon the enormous leaves of the ancestor tree, he had no method to obtain the leaf juice by himself. It was because his strength wasn't great enough to even shake the natural energy barrier around the tree leaves of the ancestor tree. Not being able to obtain the treasure while being right on top of a treasure trove had felt like mockery to him. Yet he hadn't expected that the crazy woman would know about his attempts to obtain the leaf juice. Thanks. By then, Li Yunmu had given up on trying to understand the thoughts of Yuan Biyao. She knew that he wasn't her brother Qing Yang from the start, and she wanted to keep him around her for all his life so as to take revenge against him. However, the next instant, she didn't hesitate to pay any price to extricate him, even daring to fight against Origin God sect. "Aren't you afraid that after I return to the Origin world, I will reveal everything about Origin God sect to the upper echelons of Underworld Serpent?" he suddenly asked. "Are you an idiot? If you dare to reveal any information regarding the Origin God world outside, Origin God sect won't hesitate to send a deity-level powerhouse to eliminate you as well as anyone related to you." Yuan Biyao looked at Li Yunmu like he was a total fool. When Li Yunmu heard her words, he didn't dare to open his mouth again. He suddenly felt like he was really being an idiot. If Origin God sect was the Origin God sect which he had infiltrated based on the information by Underworld Serpent, he wouldn't have cared about spilling all its secrets since that would present him with a lot of merit. But the reality was that the so-called second-tier sect was actually an enormously powerful and mysterious power. And Li Yunmu wasn't a fool who would invite a calamity upon himself by leaking this to the outside. As long as he didn't reveal the secret of the Origin God world, Origin God sect would possibly refrain from shooting the rat for fear of breaking the vase. They would know that he wouldn't dare to willingly take the step which they would hate. While Li Yunmu was thinking about these concerns, his senses regarding the outside world were restored again. "All right, leave now, disappear!" Ying Ying shouted out. Yuan Biyao looked at Li Yunmu with a complicated gaze. The moment he stepped out, the twin-headed salamander quickly left into the distance. The carriage quickly disappeared from Li Yunmu's eyes. He calmed himself then and surveyed his surroundings. He was quite familiar with the air around him, the air of the Origin world. He had really returned. Before, he'd been rolling around from side to side while thinking of a method to return to the Origin world. Yet out of nowhere, the crazy woman who had wanted to trap him eternally helped him return. Because he caught the eye of Origin God sect, she didn't spare any effort to get him away. Li Yunmu truly didn't know whether to laugh or to cry at his situation. However, neither Yuan Biyao nor the upper echelons of Origin God sect had any idea about what sort of enormous impact would the escape of this sleeping dragon have on the Origin God world in the future. Suddenly, Li Yunmu's complexion turned odd, and he knitted his eyebrows. He wondered whether such an escape would be good or bad for him in the long run. Apart from experiencing a heaven-shaking transformation in his strength, Li Yunmu had also obtained another indescribable benefit before leaving. It was the fact that he had linked the heavenly bridge to the Origin God world. In secret, he had connected it to the room where he lived in the Origin God town among commoners. None of the people in the Origin God world had even considered the possibility of such a thing happening. Even if the other party had already sealed all the pathways to itself, Li Yunmu possessed the sacrificial platform. Once he connected a place to it, he could draw the heavenly bridge and enter the place, for example the Origin God world in this case. Even Underworld Serpent probably didn't expect that Li Yunmu would possess such an deity-level tool which could penetrate through worlds. Origin God sect, the mysterious Origin God sect, I hope we meet again one day, Li Yunmu muttered in his heart while silently watching the surrounding wilderness. Soon, he erupted with all his flux energy and rushed away at his highest speed. Although Yuan Biyao had sent him out, staying in one place for a long time wasn't good. At that moment, Li Yunmu, who had just returned to the Origin world after several months, displayed the enormous change in his strength and revealed the power of Great Circle and 108 flux points. Profound flux energy overflowed from his legs and like an ultra-fast propeller, and he quickly surpassed the speed of sound. In a blink of an eye, he couldn't be seen anywhere near where he'd alighted. At that moment in Green Goblin Mountains, Demon snapped his head up all of a sudden and looked in the distance through the darkness of the night. This is Master. It really is Master's presence. He has finally returned. A rarely seen excitement appeared on Demon's cold face. Because of the bond between master and follower formed by binding the latter's soul imprint to the heavenly world, once Li Yunmu appeared, Demon immediately sensed him. The next instant, Demon took out a red crystal crane and without any hesitation released it. Pang! A muffled sound echoed in the darkness of the night. Li Yunmu had jumped down from a height of several tens of meters and was gazing at a village not far away. He suddenly looked at the sky and asked, "System, what part of the Origin world is this?" Information insufficient for precise location, but based on the information from the database, the host should be in the eastern part of the Origin world named the Ancient Lands. Ancient Lands? How certain are you about this guess? Li Yunmu's voice turned somewhat cold. System thought for a moment, then replied with certainty according to the data collected about the nature of every region, the system is more than 90% certain. What a great coincidence, Ancient Lands. Isn't this the place where the Black Spirit Valley is located about which Demon just told me? Zhanhua, I didn't expect that we would run into each other so soon. Li Yunmu calmly gazed at the night, then began to quietly walk toward the nearest village. He hadn't thought that something would happen just before he returned to the Origin world. Demon's red crystal crane had made him aware about some matters related to him which he had missed while being in the Origin God world for the last couple months. Chapter 494 Another Trap. In the middle of the night, the village in the depths of a wilderness was silent. Regardless of whether it was people or other creatures, all of them were calm. Li Yunmu's entrance into the region was akin to a giant beast intruding into the silence of the night. In the Origin world, there were many similar villages in the wilderness. They were countless, and most of them were mainly formed by barbarians. Ka-cha! The sound of withered twigs being stepped on during such a silent night was quite ear-piercing. When Li Yunmu arrived in front of the entrance of the village, he could vaguely identify the words written on the village plate with his keen vision Black Night Village. At this time, one of the two barbarian soldiers who were responsible for guarding the Black Knight village woke up and asked in a tone filled with cautiousness, "Who is it?" "A passerby. I wanted to ask something, is this eastern part's ancient lands?" Li Yunmei was adorning black robe which hid even his face. It made him look like a devil. The sudden appearance and the unsettling clothes made the two barbarian soldiers who had just woken up felt like they should be extremely cautious. In the origin world, barbarian villages had to face many life and death crises, and the countless ferocious beasts were just one of them. The main danger was actually their own species. Sometimes, if their reply wasn't good enough or their luck ran out and they encountered an extremely cruel human, it could become the cause of the whole village's extermination. But upon seeing that the less than 2-meter-tall human clad in black clothes had made no movements apart from inquiring about the region, both of the barbarian soldiers breathed a sigh of relief. Strangely, the man didn't even seem to have any intention of entering the village. "Yes, your distinguished self, this is indeed the ancient lands in the eastern region," one of the barbarian soldiers hastily replied. "Oh, then how far is the Black Spirit Valley? I want a map of the local area." Li Yunmei raised his hand and threw a small pouch toward the two barbarian soldiers. Inside the pouch, there were at least 100 silver sand coins. The two soldiers were completely astonished and quickly accepted the money. They then looked at each other, and one of them said, "I ask your distinguished self to wait for a moment. I will go and fetch the map." Even if Li Yunmei was being ostentatious, they didn't dare to invite him into the village. They had many apprehensions regarding the mysterious person who had suddenly appeared from the wilderness in the middle of the night. However, Li Yunmei remained indifferent and just smiled at them. It was the cruel truth of the world. Even if the weak gathered together in one place, they wouldn't have the power to protect themselves no matter in which corner of the world they lived. If Li Yunmei wanted to conceal his tracks, the people of the village before him would wake up to a nightmare in the middle of the night and would stop to exist before the sun rose in the morning. The barbarians in the village didn't have any right to their life in front of him, and it was the same for Li Yunmei when in front of the entire Origin God sect. Thus, even if he had returned to the Origin world, he didn't forget to hide his tracks. The black gown and the devil mask were quite commonly used by the cultivators of the Origin world to conceal their identity. If someone was suspicious by nature, they would even make sure that the night black village of 100-something people wouldn't exist anymore. But Li Yunmei didn't even consider acting in such a manner. Even if they weren't people of Earth, he didn't want to engage in such meaningless massacre. Soon, he accepted the map of the region and disappeared into the night under the cautious gazes of the two barbarian soldiers. Inside the heavenly world, Li Yunmei took out the map and scanned it once before unleashing his flux energy. The next instant, the map was torn into shreds. With the existence of system, he only needed to look at it once for it all to be recorded by the system. The system's previous judgment of their location hadn't been mistaken. They were indeed in the easternmost part of the eastern region, ancient lands. But naturally, Li Yunmei was aware that the people of the Origin world hadn't reached the endpoint of their world in any direction. The reason why ancient lands were considered as one of the easternmost regions was mainly because if someone continued moving eastwards, they would find themselves unable to go any farther. The noteworthy fact was that the ends of the continent were unknown because according to rumor, even if deities personally charged into the Far East to probe it, they never returned in one piece. Because of that, the ancient lands, which was one of the regions in the most extreme corner, were considered as the known eastern frontier since a long time ago. Black Spirit Valley, which Li Yunmei was inquiring about, was located precisely at one corner of this region. "Oh, seems like it's not far away. It's only 1,000 or so kilometers away." After scanning the map, he roughly estimated the distance between his current location and Black Spirit Valley. At this time, the system's voice suddenly echoed in his brain, "If the map provided by those barbarian soldiers is correct, then the exact distance would be 1,236 kilometers. If Host rushes forth at full speed and faces no obstructions, Host could reach the region in less than 3 hours. Host, Do you intend to rush to Black Spirit Valley immediately? No need to be anxious. It's said that Black Spirit Valley only has one third-tier regional power. Yes, based on what the people on Whale Island were talking, there is indeed only one publicly known third-tier regional power in Black Spirit Valley, the system replied. Publicly known. When Li Yunmu heard it, he became thoughtful. After staying in the origin world for so long, Li Yunmu naturally wasn't a fool to believe that the situation was so simple. Only one third-tier regional power existed in the easternmost region, which had been discovered long ago. Besides that, since Zhang Wei had chosen to conceal himself, there was certainly something there that wasn't known to most people. Regardless of how one looked at it, Black Spirit Valley definitely wasn't as simple as it looked. But naturally, it could also be that Li Yunmu was just being paranoid. Then host, what do you intend to do next? System seemed to be attaching great importance to this matter, sounding afraid that Li Yunmu might take some reckless action and fall into a trap. Earlier, Demon's Red Crystal Crane had not only informed Li Yunmu about the result of Underworld Serpent's investigation into the situation of Descenders, but also presented him with some other facts as well. Surprisingly, while he was gone, Li Qinghong had replaced him in carrying out the plan. Because of that, Demon said that Black Spirit Valley was where she was most likely present. Chapter 495 Great Flux Expert Armor. By comparing and contrasting the information obtained from the Underworld Serpent regarding the Descenders, Li Yunmu instantly knew that Li Qinghong was after Zhang Wei. And his main priority at that moment was to immediately save her. But Li Yunmu was calm because he knew that 10 days had already passed since the situation had developed. If Li Qinghong was in a crisis, she would have died long ago. In any case, he was extremely perplexed that a trifling third-tier power of Black Spirit Valley had methods to cause the connection between master and follower to completely disappear. Before he had gone to the Origin God world where the ancestor tree was present, he could still vaguely sense the existence of Devil Monkey, Blade Overlord, and the rest who had remained on Earth. Could some sort of strange existence similar to World Ancestor be concealed in the Black Spirit Valley as well? As for inquiring about it from the system, Li Yunmu understood what made it anxious. He thought for a moment before saying, I need to increase my strength before anything else. Li Yunmu was extremely clear that even if the Black Spirit Valley had only one third-tier power as known publicly, he would have only his own to rely on when he entered that place. If his strength wasn't sufficient, he had no place to think about invading a third-tier sect. This was simple reality. That was why his priority was to increase his cultivation and step into Great Flux Expert Realm. People of that level possessed a completely different grade of power compared to Flux Experts. He had already cultivated the 108 Flux points, but he still lacked the Great Flux Expert Battle Armor. In truth, congealing his Great Flux Expert's battle armor was quite simple. He only needed to confirm that the flux energy accumulated in the 108 flux points was sufficiently pure. Li Yunmu didn't know about the purity of the flux energy which he had cultivated. First of all, while cultivating the first 72 points before descending to the origin world, he had relied on the dimensional beast crystals to open and fill them. However, when he had repaired his innate body constitution, he had also complemented the deficiency of his 72 points. It needn't be even mentioned that when using such mixed cultivation processes, the purity of the flux energy poured into his flux points would have some problems. What concerned the final 36 points, especially the final 3 main points, they had been cultivated on the leaves of World Ancestor. Because of that, he had a feeling that the purity of his flux energy wouldn't be any worse than compared to that of the ordinary flux experts of the origin world. In fact, he was confident that his flux energy strength was several times more formidable. System, what's my present flux energy strength? While he said this, his heartbeat sped up. Ever since he had cultivated the final flux point in the core of Sea Devil Beast, he hadn't inquired about it. Host, your present flux energy strength has reached 900 points. Then what about my physical strength? 185 oxen. From its reply, Li Yunmu finally gained a rough understanding of his strength, that his physical body was tyrannical compared to those of ordinary cultivators. 900 points flux energy was 5 times what flux experts who had only cultivated 105 flux points would have. The maximum strength of his attack was 5 times higher compared to that of the majority of flux experts in the origin world. What was the significance of this number? Probably as long as people understood what the words 5 times meant, they would clearly understand the disparity. It was like the difference between the strength of an adult and a child. In other words, given Li Yunmu's present strength, even if he didn't use all of his formidable physical strength to deal with the cultivators of the same level, he could still insta-kill them. But Li Yunmu was clear on the fact that this sort of disparity existed because the majority of cultivators of the origin world didn't cultivate all 108 flux points. What's the disparity when compared to cultivators at Great Circle? He asked. In the origin god world, the system had secretly scanned and inputted the data of many cultivators who had cultivated all 108 flux points. Based on those calculations, the flux energy strength of those cultivators ranged between 300 to 360 points. The system's reply didn't specify a certain upper limit, but it told him that if an ordinary cultivator cultivated 108 points, their flux energy strength would only range between 300 to 360 units. With this, Li Yunmu's understanding towards his strength increased by another level. After cultivating the meridian nurturing flux point technique, a seemingly ordinary cultivation method, his flux energy strength had surprisingly swollen to 3 times larger to that of the Great Circle flux experts and 5 times to that of ordinary flux experts. After the system provided and explained him all the data about the disparity between him and the other flux experts, he gained some understanding why the Origin God sect wanted to capture him to the extent that even the sect master had to personally issue a command. But even then, Li Yunmu didn't even consider that the actual reason why Origin God sect had wanted to capture him might be to have him act as a breeder. Yes, this was the real reason why the people of Origin God sect were so anxious to capture Li Yunmu. When they thought about his extraordinary constitution and the weak bodies of the natives of their world, this idea had risen in the minds of the upper echelons of Origin God sect. Although it was unclear to them why Li Yunmu had to attack the chest and abdomen main points so many times, his exceptionally formidable constitution as well as the fact that he had absorbed 10 times more energy to fill the points was sufficient to cause Origin God sect to look toward him to strengthen the entire Origin God world. Yuan Biyao clearly understood this point, which was why she had renounced her desire to trap him for an eternity and instead spared no efforts to resist against Origin God sect and return him to Origin world. Yuan Biyao was unable to accept such an outcome for him where Origin God sect would treated him as a breeder. That was why she had fought so hard. Although Li Yunmu had a vague sense of why Origin God sect had wanted to capture him, the real reason had definitely never crossed his mind. This wasn't a fault in his intelligence, but rather a problem of not being a native of the Origin God world who wielded power, which was why he wouldn't think of such an angle. After learning that his flux energy strength was 5 times higher compared to that of ordinary flux experts, Li Yunmu finally had the confidence to congeal his great flux expert armor. If the purity of his flux energy wasn't sufficient, he would just use the excess power to cross the threshold. He had no reason to doubt himself. If he was to fail with a 5 times greater amount of flux energy, it would be an enormous joke. Chapter 496 Types of Expert Armor. It was said that when a flux expert stepped into the Great Circle and started the process of congealing their armor, the process wasn't the same for every person. In other words, if 1,000 flux experts congealed their great flux expert armor, all of them would be different. There would be 1,000 different expert armors. Thus, the process and calculation for congealing the great flux expert armor were equally important. When a cultivator wanted to congeal a formidable great flux expert armor, one had to take into consideration their resources, background, and talent. A formidable great flux expert's armor was actually dependent on the origin of the flux expert. Previously, Li Yunmu had seen a lot of information and gained a lot of experience regarding congealing the Great Flux Expert armor. He'd even asked the system to prepare since a long time ago, as well as had made a lot of preparations himself. If Li Yunmu claimed that his calculating ability was second in the world, then no one would claim the first position for themselves. The reason for that was very simple, because he had the system which had assisted him during the entire planning section before congealing the Great Flux Expert armor. At that moment, Li Yunmu was hovering over the center of the lake in his heavenly world in a cross-legged position. Before that he had taken a shower, changed his clothes, burned an incense, and conditioned himself to be in the peak state. By then, his heart had attained unprecedented tranquility. The land in front of him was filled with a pile of objects emitting treasure light. At first glance, it could be ascertained that there were more than 10 items in it. According to what he knew from the flux experts of the origin world, there were 3 methods to congeal a Great Flux Expert armor. First method was basic congealing. This method was very simple, basically reflected in the name. The core of this congealing was the simplest material to congeal an armor. For example, sacred steel, or perhaps ocean ironwood, and so on. It required the materials comparable to steel or iron. They had to be modeled using one's flux energy to congeal the most basic type of Great Flux Expert armor. Under ordinary circumstances, the defense of the armor congealed using this method would be pretty good, but that was its only good characteristic. Apart from raising their owner's defense, this sort of armor had at most one more supplementary ability to amplify their flux energy strength by 1/3. This was the most basic congealing. A Great Flux Expert armor congealed with this technique was better than not having anything, but it was the weakest, most ordinary, and basic type of armor. But because the majority of the cultivators didn't possess the resources and circumstances to chase after an even higher layer Flux Expert armor, it was congealed by the majority of flux experts in the origin world. It wasn't that nobody wanted to congeal even better or more formidable Great Flux Expert armor, but that they were out of options. Under normal circumstances, they would be thankful to the heavens if they could maintain their cultivation speed and not fall behind. The second method of congealing the armor was called opulent congealing. This method was far better compared to the first one. Apart from using good defensive metals like ironwood as in the first method, it required materials like the main currency of the origin world, namely silver sand coins and so on. As previously mentioned, the silver sand and gold granule coins were created from secret silver and gold located at the bottom of the seabed. Compared to other materials, they could conduct flux energy much better. Because of that, opulent congealing was a method in which one threw their money to congeal the Great Flux Expert armor. The number of people who followed this method was only second to the number of people who congealed their armor using the first method. The prerequisite to using was that one had to possess ample wealth. Otherwise, even if ordinary people wanted to use silver sand or gold granules, they wouldn't be able to produce several tons or even several tens of tons at the drop of a hat. This was the reason why such a thing had become the hard currency used by ordinary people. Since flux experts also needed them in large amounts, these 2 types of materials had been accepted as the mainstream currency of the origin world. In terms of functionality, the armor congealed using the second method was much better when compared to the basic congealing. Apart from possessing pretty good defense, the amplification of flux energy strength reached up to 50%, which made it much better compared to the first type of basic armor. Moreover, after adding the silver sand and golden granules, the congealed flux expert armor also possessed shield energy. Although the strength of the protective shield energy wasn't very formidable, it could resist some of the energy and spiritual attacks. It also possessed the ability of most basic screening of body odor, presence, and energy. After investing their silver sand and golden granules, the fiercely rich could even exploit the shield energy to stay at deep sea layer or lower for a longer period of time. That being said, the second type, opulent congealing, was much better compared to the first type. As for how much, that depended upon the silver sand and gold granules invested by the cultivator's family. Several tons was the most basic requirement. Some people would use just that, but others would use several tens of tons, even reaching up to 100. The Great Flux Expert armor congealed using this process also provided a large flux energy amplification. Some of the extremely enormous Great Flux Expert armor were even comparable to the top-notch Treasure congealed armor. That was right, the third type of method to congeal the flux armor was known as treasure congealing. The only people who could choose this method were every region's elite, and not even ordinary ones, but rather the elites of first-tier sects. They either possessed a family with enormous background and resources or were considered as future successors of a powerful sect. Only this type of people could possess the confidence to choose treasure refining. This method comprised of using sacred steel, silver sand, and gold granules as foundation. The worth mentioning fact here would be that these were the most basic materials. After the three types of metals, treasured tools, and deity soldier weapons available in the origin world had to be added into the mix. They were followed by some rarely seen heavenly treasures for assistance. Only after using the above-mentioned materials could treasure armor be congealed. It was viewed as the most powerful type of Great Flux Expert armor that could be congealed by the people of the origin world. Its strength was reflected in the formidable defense and powerful shield energy. Compared to ordinary opulent armor, the abilities of treasure armor were on another level. Its most prominent feature was that it possessed a characteristic called expert armor, which was a formidable ability that would awaken in the one who congealed such an armor. Chapter 497, Going through all the resources. This sort of formidable ability of special nature would give the Flux Expert armor a very exclusive upgrade. On top of that, the most important fact was that it was an ability and not simple strength or combat effectiveness. It was extremely possible that the special nature of such an ability might not be suited for battle. With every evolution, one would come in possession of even more strange abilities. This was called treasure congealing. The flux energy amplification rate of Great Flux Expert armor congealed using treasure congealing was 10% higher compared to opulent armor. Just because of this reason, even if the other characteristics of treasure congealed armor weren't counted, the starting point of people who congealed this armor would be higher simply based on the flux energy amplification. So what then? What about the armor which Li Yunmu was seeking to congeal? Naturally, it wasn't treasure congealed armor. Reason? There was no reason for Li Yunmu to renounce the best method of congealing armor and congeal a low-level Great Flux Expert armor, right? Actually, it was very simple. Besides the three types of methods mentioned earlier, there was still a fourth type of method for congealing the Great Flux Expert armor. The reason why it wasn't listed was because this method wasn't recognized by the cultivators of the origin world. Moreover, probably not even 1 in 10,000 people possessed the required resources and qualifications to realize it. No, in fact, probably even in 1 million people who congealed Great Flux Expert armor, there might not be a single person who possessed the qualifications and ability to congeal the fourth type of Great Flux Expert armor. It was called innate expert armor. There wasn't any need to explain it much, since just from the name, the dominance of this expert armor could be seen, as well as the difficulty in obtaining the qualifications to congeal it. If Li Yunmu hadn't made a trip to the origin god world, then perhaps even with years of accumulation and foundation he could have built while his cultivation had been stopped at Flux Expert realm, he might still not have come into possession of the strength and resources required to congeal innate expert armor. But right then, he was pretty certain he could do it. When Li Yunmu took out the object required to congeal this type of expert armor, a complicated expression appeared on his face. It was a thumb-sized transparent bottle which emitted green light. Yes, it was the 5 drops of leaf juice of the ancestor tree which Yuan Biyao had given him not long ago. However, when Li Yunmu carefully observed it, he'd found that there weren't just 5 drops of leaf juice as he had believed previously. Instead, there was also a fruit seed in the little green bottle. When Li Yunmu saw that small fruit seed, his breathing instantly became heavy. If it was what he thought it was, then it was a seed produced by the fruit of the ancestor tree. According to legends, the vitality of an entire plain was required to grow a new world tree. It could then be classified as a personal world tree. Even if Li Yunmu was an idiot, he would still understand that such a seed had an indescribable value. Yet he planned to use the 5 drops of leaf juice and the seed as materials to congeal innate expert armor. It was an extravagance that couldn't be put into words. But if not for the ancestor tree's seed, he would have no hope to be able to congeal the innate expert armor which not even 1 in a million were able to congeal. Before long, Li Yunmu took out rare heavenly treasures from his storage space. Instantly, his surroundings filled with dozens of magnificent lights. System, what are my chances of success in congealing the innate expert armor? When Li Yunmu had taken out his wealth, all the resources he had accumulated for a long time, he finally asked the system to find his odds for success. Congratulations host, with the usage of World Ancestors leaf juice and seed, according to system's calculation, your chances of success in congealing the innate expert armor have reached 40%. Surprisingly they're that high. Even Li Yunmu himself was astonished. By adding 2 different materials from the ancestor tree, he had surprisingly raised the originally less than 10% chances to 40%. He had prepared 100 tons of sacred steel, 100 tons of silver sand, and 10 tons of gold granules. This large amount of silver sand and gold granules had been obtained from selling the fur, horns, and meat of the monsters he had killed while hacking in the mid-sea region on Blue Moon Island. Although the prices of the materials weren't high by themselves, the amounts that he needed were enormous. It has to be known that the 10 shadows together with 300 ape gods had only collected enough after killing vicious beasts for days and nights without stopping. He had sold them all then and invested the money in his future cultivation. But even after he had exhausted all his options, he could only achieve treasure congealing. However, after he added the 2 materials from the ancestor tree, he had reached 40% chance of success in congealing the innate expert armor. Only after personally experiencing this did he realize about what sort of an unimaginable resource was a twig of world ancestor. Yet even though he had 40% chance of success, it still wasn't enough. Soon, Li Yunmu also invested all the sacred life water which he had obtained from earth. From his original amount, he now had 30 drops left. How about now? Li Yunmu asked again. The system remained silent for a good while before replying after performing a lot of calculations. 45%. 30 drops of sacred life water could only increase his odds by less than 10%. This was outrageous. It has to be known that sacred life water was a major trump card which Battle Sage Vig had been saving for many years. If on Earth, even if someone wanted to use the domain of a capital city to trade for 30 drops of sacred life water, people would think before exchanging. Yet they could only increase his chances by 5%. Insufficient, so insufficient. What if I use the 12 Rainbow Light King's crystal armor as the base for congealing the armor, what would be my chances of success then? Li Yunmu asked. 49%. This time the system's reply was quicker. Perhaps, it had performed the calculations regarding this question previously. So little? Even after adding in the 12 Rainbow Light King crystal armor, I could only increase the odds by 3%. Only after genuinely trying to congeal innate expert armor did he understand that it was simply an endless pit. Heaven only knew how hard it was to actually succeed. If Host's 12 Rainbow Light King's crystal armor had the 12 lights condensed, then it would increase the chances by 10%, but Host doesn't have even 1 light. Li Yunmu understood what the system was implying. Chapter 498 Snake Goddess Scale. Li Yunmu could do nothing about it. There wasn't enough time for him to return to Earth and enter the King's true territory to slowly gather King Beast's flux crystals to condense the 12 rainbow lights. What else do I have to increase my chances of congealing the innate expert armor? Li Yunmu took the final step and allowed the system to make precise calculations for him. If Host uses the wings of wind, then your odds of success would rise to 55%, the system said after some thought. If Dark Ghost King armor was to be added on top of the foundation, your chances would rise to 65%. What else? It's still not enough. Li Yunmu exhaled deeply. He hadn't thought that the bet for this grand gamble would be so great. If he lost, then all the resources he had accumulated over the years would disappear without any exception. There is still a one item left. If the host uses the 3 parts of Azure Dragon Deity Battle Suit, especially the Azure Dragon Sage Pearl, then the odds would reach 80%. In the end, the system had turned toward the most valuable item on Li Yunmu, the Azure Dragon Deity Suit. Its 3 parts surprisingly increased his chances of success by 15%. They were indeed worthy of being parts of one of the 5 supreme battle suits of Earth. According to this speculation, if he could invest all 5 parts of a battle suit, his chances of success would probably increase by 30%. Yet Li Yunmu hesitated. If I invest the 3 parts of Azure Dragon Deity Suit, then when I obtain the final 2 parts in the future, wouldn't the Azure Dragon Deity Battle Suit become useless since it could no longer be completed? Be at ease, host. The innate expert armor can also evolve. You needn't be afraid of this, since at the time you obtain the other 2 parts of Azure Dragon Deity Suit, you will be able to add them to the innate expert armor. It would then evolve to become even more formidable, the system explained with absolute certainty. When Li Yunmu heard this, he couldn't help but breathe a deep sigh of relief. According to what the system said, if the 3 parts of Azure Dragon Deity Suit, the Black Ghost King armor as well as the 12 Rainbow Light King crystal armor were invested into congealing the Great Flux expert armor, not only would their original abilities not disappear, they might even evolve to become more formidable. Are you certain? He couldn't help but ask for another confirmation. After all, given the importance of Azure Dragon Deity Suit, he couldn't afford to lose it. The system doesn't dare to be certain. Everything is based on the information collected through various sources which were analyzed repeatedly. But the system has at least 80% certainty that the innate expert armor itself possesses the property of independently refining the best features of things from which it was congealed. The system replied sincerely. 80% never mind. Li Yunmu bit his lip before making his mind and settling on a decision. With the system giving him 80%, he would dare to attempt it. He believed in the system's calculating ability, but 80% probably only guaranteed that parts of Azure Dragon Deity Suit wouldn't fall into oblivion as well as that nothing would go wrong with them. But it had no relation with his odds of success in congealing the innate expert armor. Li Yunmu didn't dare to gamble on it with only 80% chance for success. Li Yunmu shook his head before continuing his inquiry. Still insufficient. Do I have some other resources which could be thrown upon it? Nothing. The host only has 2 more treasures which possess the qualifications to be invested. The system is afraid that host won't want to use them here, the system replied after some thought. Li Yunmu quickly understood the system's meaning. You mean the Void Disk and Refining Pagoda? The system's words were correct. Li Yunmu indeed wouldn't invest those 2 transcending sage treasures here. First of all, the Refining Pagoda was a treasure on which Li Yunmu depended to substitute his dwindling resources. As for Void Disk, it was also extremely important. The ability to break all restrictions and shackles in space had no substitutes for it. If he invested it here, then when Li Yunmu encountered some restrictions in the future, he would be completely powerless to deal with them. Apart from them, are there truly no other treasure which cross the threshold of items that could be used to congeal the innate expert armor? Li Yunmu refused the earlier suggestion, but still kept asking without giving up. Perhaps, there still is one treasure. If host is willing to invest this item, then your odds of congealing the innate expert armor would rise from 80% to 95%, the system said after some hesitation. Which item? Li Yunmu was startled. What sort of forbidden sage treasure did he still possess which could compare to the 3 parts of Azure Dragon Deity Suit? Snake Goddess Scale, the system replied while enunciating each word. When Li Yunmu heard it, he took in a deep breath. If the system hadn't spoken about it, he wouldn't have even remembered that he'd once obtained such an item. It was the scale of a deity subordinate to an ancient god. But ever since the little shadow ancestor had entered, it hadn't shown back up. Li Yunmu didn't know anything about the world which existed or was perhaps connected to the snake scale. The location of the little shadow ancestor was also unknown. But once the system mentioned it, he was finally reminded of its existence. He thought it over and over again, and finally decided to add snake goddess scale to the armor because he was certain that if it was a genuine remnant of a deity, it would never lose its divine ability because of being congealed into innate expert armor. How could divine abilities be so weak that they would disappear so easily? Thus, he wasn't anxious that after refining the snake scale, the little shadow ancestor might not have any way to return in the future. Alright, so it's decided. Instantly, Li Yunmu made his decision. 95% success chance was already high enough to astonish people. Although there was still a 5% chance that he might fail, his cultivation of so many years would have been in vain if he still didn't dare to risk it with such high odds of success. Okay. Host, prepare to begin the congealing. The system will keep providing directions regarding the congealing steps and particulars. Upon hearing the system's words, Li Yunmu felt relieved. The process of congealing the innate expert armor was extremely important, so even the slightest mistake might cause the process to fail. But with the existence of the system, he wasn't afraid that there might be any human error or negligence. Under its directions, Li Yunmu stimulated the 12 Rainbow Light King crystal armor. According to the system's congealing process, the first step was to use the 12 Rainbow Light King crystal armor as foundation. The process of congealing would be different for the majority of people. However, the method derived by the system after repeated calculations and analysis had to be more efficient and optimistic. Following the system's suggestion, Li Yunmu began to move the flux energy from all 108 flux points at high speed, as per the igniting flux energy method to congeal the armor followed in the origin world. Chapter 499 Ferven. First step, purify the King Crystal Armor for 1837 seconds. As Li Yunmu began to congeal the innate expert armor, the system provided him with detailed guidance from the very beginning. The purification method and its length would guarantee that the entire 12 Rainbow Light King Crystal Armor would be thoroughly purified and could be used as a base for the innate expert armor. The suggestions provided by the system were precise to the point of raising anyone's hackles. It counted everything to seconds, not one more or less. At that moment, a countdown going from 1837 seconds had appeared in Li Yunmu's consciousness. See. As long as he wasn't an idiot or didn't doze off, then even if he wanted to, he would still find it difficult to make any mistakes. Flux energy combustion was a method for refining while congealing the great flux expert armor. In the air, two majestic balls of flux flame floated above Li Yunmu's hands. Under the control of the world power, the 12 Rainbow Light King crystal armor floating in the air was slowly becoming more transparent from being burned. As each second and minute passed, some simple but varied traces and runes began to gradually appear on the surface of the crystal armor. It was the genuine core of expert armor. As time passed, the number of mysterious runes began to increase. Their color also began to darken. Second step, add the Black Ghost King armor and purify it for 396 seconds. Li Yunmu continued the process meticulously, his attention focused only on his task. Without catching his breath, he immediately commanded with his thought, and the Black Ghost King armor floating in mid-air moved to the middle of the two flux flames. The whole process went without any hitches. At that moment, Li Yunmu wasn't using only the system's precise calculations to congeal the armor, but also he whirled power of the heavenly world to save himself some energy and get some assistance. With the thought, the world power could assimilate any material which was to be purified. When the Black Ghost King armor was continuously burned by the flux flame, Li Yunmu saw that it gradually melted and permeated into the 12 Rainbow Light King crystal armor. 1 second, 10 seconds, 100 seconds, 326 seconds. The time for purifying was quite short, less than 7 minutes. Once it was about to be finished, Li Yunmu heard the system's voice once again. Third step, add the Azure Dragon Arm Gauntlet and purify it for 3811 seconds. Although it was just a part of a supreme battle suit, the time required to purify it far surpassed what he'd needed for Black Ghost King armor. The time difference between the former and the latter was about 10 times. Li Yunmui calmed his heart and continued to follow the set of procedures provided by the system, operating without any mistakes. At this instant, he didn't dare to get distracted. If he made a single mistake during the process of purification, there was a good chance that his congealing would fail. After all, it would definitely lower his chances. From the start, Li Yunmui didn't have a 100% chances of success, so if the chances were lowered, it was extremely probable that he might fail in the risk he had chosen to take. As a consequence of such a loss, all the treasures which he had invested would turn into dregs. Even Li Yunmui himself wouldn't be able to estimate the exact amount of value as well as benefits provided by all of them. Therefore, he definitely couldn't make any mistakes or let an error happen. So his entire focus and energy were concentrated on his tasks. It has to be said that this was a matter which properly tested a person's calmness while putting extreme pressure on them. However, Li Yunmui had been sharpening himself on the grindstone for a long time. He had forcibly turned himself into an accurate machine, smoothly completing all steps. After the purification of Azure Dragon gauntlets, it was time to purify Azure Dragon leg guards. Once that was done, it was time to add the Azure Dragon Sage pair. The Dragon Pearl was the core energy source of Azure Dragon Deity Suit. By the time Li Yunmui was covered in sweat, the expert armor which had been purified began to emit magnificent lights and extraordinary pressure. Li Yunmui's heart began to beat fiercely. Success! Surprisingly, just by purifying and fusing 4 items, the first stage of congealing the expert armor had been completed. It's a treasure armor, Li Yunmui cried out in his heart. That was right. By using the Black Ghost King armor together with 3 parts of Azure Dragon Deity Suit as well as 12 Rainbow Light King Crystal armor as base, Li Yunmui had already been successful in the third type of congealing, the treasure congealing, and produced a treasure armor. But that was only the start. He was yet to even use the silver sand, gold granules, and sacred steel. That meant, it would be the highest grade expert armor which could be congealed by the Flux experts of the origin world. From this, the rarity and preciousness of the 3 parts of Azure Dragon Deity Suit could be clearly seen. The quality of the materials used in congealing the armor determined everything. Li Yunmui couldn't help but take a glance at the innate expert armor which was far from taking form. When he took a look at the ability and characteristics of it, he was stunned. He didn't dare to investigate the specifics, but he could sense that the flux energy amplification provided by this expert armor which hadn't been formed yet was already 100%. It had yet to be completed, but it had already achieved the highest amplification rate of between 50 to 100%. Clearly, it had already reached the level of the perfect and top-notch treasure armor. But this wasn't Li Yunmui's target. For a split second, Li Yunmui remained somewhat distracted, but he was soon brought out of his reverie by the system which gave him the procedures for the 5th step. He first added the silver sand, all 100 tons of it which were piled on the ground in the heavenly world, forming a small mountain. If the ordinary people of the origin world could see it, they would definitely go crazy. Silver sand was just the most basic material for congealing the innate expert material and nothing more. 100 tons of it might seem like a very large amount, but after being purified continuously by the flux flame, it was like a moth in the fire. Under the manipulation of Li Yunmui's world power, it took the shape of a silver dragon and entered the expert armor in a steady stream. Before long, the expert armor began to take shape. The completely transparent body of the expert armor filled with mysterious runes, then many rays of silver starlight were emitted from it like stars from a crystal body, twinkling with silver shine. After more than 10 minutes, all of the 100 tons of silver sand were finished. They were followed by 5 tons of gold granules, after which a large amount of sacred steel was added into the mix. It was purified and turned into melted steel before slowly permeating the whole armor. After the three types of most basic materials had been used, a fervent gaze appeared in Li Yunmu's eyes. There was no need to talk about how formidable the unformed expert armor was, but seeing its outer appearance and characteristics, anyone would be fascinated. The armor was sparkling and translucent, filled with little specks of silver shine which couldn't conceal the even more dazzling golden threads. They covered the armor like hair a person's head and were the result of adding gold granules. Chapter 500 The Backlash from Azure Dragon's Holy Spirit. The most basic reason for using silver sand while congealing the great Flux expert armor was to increase the movement of Flux energy, which would allow the cultivator to use the Flux energy in their body at a quick speed. The effect of gold granules, however, was allowing the Flux energy to accumulate quicker and be more compressed. This increased the amount of Flux energy with which the person could erupt in their attack. As for the sacred steel, this material was used for the great Flux expert armor to increase its physical defense. Sacred steel possessed high density and usually couldn't be penetrated. After being purified by the Flux flame, it would become much more lightweight, which turned it into an extremely useful resource which couldn't be replaced. But it didn't have any effect on the amplification of Flux energy. Moreover, sacred steel was produced on the seabed in enormous amounts, so it hadn't become one of the mainstream currencies of the origin world. By the time Li Yunmu finished adding the three types of most basic materials, he had already spent more than a day manufacturing the armor without noticing it. 9th, add sacred life water. At this time, system's instructions didn't include purifying. After all, if he tried to purify the sacred life water with his Flux flame, it would simply evaporate. That was why it could only be naturally assimilated. As for the reason why the word assimilate was used, it was because the expert armor still in the process of being congealed had already begun to take shape and display certain characteristics. When Li Yunmu dropped the 30 drops of sacred life water on the incomplete expert armor, it instantly absorbed the sacred life water like it had some kind of intelligence. Add the seed of world ancestor tree. Target expert armor's abdomen position, the system instructed once more. With meticulousness, Li Yunmu followed each and every one of system's orders perfectly. The next step was to use the 5 drops of the ancestor tree's leaf juice. Li Yunmu didn't drop them on the incomplete innate expert armor, but on the location of the seed. When he completed this step, the incomplete innate expert armor began to shine with a green light. The halo became increasingly more intense, until the entire heavenly world sky was illuminated. The legendary innate expert armor which not even one among million might possess was a success. Li Yunmu's heart clenched, and he began to wait anxiously while attentively watching the expert armor without blinking an eye. It was emitting a green light and hovering in the sky. Li Yunmu was unprecedentedly nervous. At this time, the system's anxious voice echoed in his ears. Don't be distracted, there is still a final and most important step left. Quick, erupt with the maximum amount of Flux energy you can use and push the scale of Snake Goddess toward the middle of the forehead. The system's voice was unusually anxious. It was the first time that Li Yunmu had sensed something like that, and his heart instantly trembled. He hadn't noticed how when the expert armor began releasing green light, H.A.D.W got distracted. It wasn't like him to screw up at a time like this, and it wasn't that he wasn't calm or had lost his concentration or that his mental tenacity wasn't sufficient. Rather, at that instant, the innate expert armor, which was about to be completed, released an enormous amount of spiritual energy. Li Yunmu had then been influenced by it for a split second. He thus got to experience the profound feeling of what was called ruining an enterprise for the sake of a basketful. It wasn't said that the innate expert armor was difficult to congeal for no reason. Apart from requiring enormously difficult to obtain materials, it also needed many innate treasures at the level world ancestors' leaf juice. Yet even then the incomplete armor put up a great resistance and counterattacked while being manufactured. If not for the system's warning, it was like that Li Yunmu would have made a mistake at the final and most important step by staring at the green-lit armor. Li Yunmu's entire body shook. He could sense from the system's anxious tone that time was pressing. Without thinking more, he erupted forth with all of his flux energy which he could produce by using all of the 108 flux points. After crazily moving the flux energy, he used it to pick up the snake goddess scale. He thrust it with all his strength toward the forehead of the expert armor. Armor finished. It is certainly finished this time. Li Yunmu had used the energy stored within his whole body. Regardless of whether it was flux or physical energy, all of it was concentrated in the last strike. He felt as if he'd used danger critical strike. After this final attack, he didn't even have the energy to remain standing, his legs went soft. He quickly sat down on the ground, but he still kept firmly watching the expert armor hovering in the air. Suddenly, a loud and clear beep resounded from the system, followed by continuous notifications. Urgent request to circulate the hacking resources. Need host's nod of approval. Requesting to transfer 50 million experience and ability points. All of them will be added into expert armor. Host, you have 5 seconds to decide. 5, 4, 3, 2. Li Yunmu had no idea why the system was suddenly changing the order of proceeding, but he didn't have time to think about it. Because of his complete trust in the system, before its countdown was complete, he responded and agreed to the request to use up the enormous amount of hacking resources. 50 million experience and ability points was nothing short of crazy. Li Yunmu had been accumulating them for 2 years, since he had descended to the origin world. But he agreed without at that crucial moment, he agreed without a second thought. After his nod of approval, Li Yunmu saw the expert armor which was emitting green light before begin to shine with 2 other colors. Once it did so, green, red, and indigo lights illuminated the heavenly world. Roar! In the sky, a powerful dragon roar echoed, and an azure dragon emitting cyan light rushed out from the snake scale placed at the center of the expert armor. It roared furiously while hovering around it. This is the Holy Spirit of the Azure Dragon deity suit. Li Yunmu gazed at the furious Azure Dragon. He felt like he could sense the fury of the Holy Spirit at that moment. Yes, it was incomparably furious, because Li Yunmu had fused it with his innate expert armor. The Azure Dragon's Holy Spirit was thus trying to cause backlash. But the next instant, 2 dragons of different colors shot out from the side of the snake scale like lightning. One of them was red while the other one was blue. Clearly, they were formed from the 50 million experience and ability points which he had transferred to the system just then. The 2 dragons, which sometimes seemed like normal dragons and sometimes like flood dragons, closed in on the Azure Dragon's Holy Spirit from both left and right. They tried to tear it apart, and the 3 of them lost themselves in the fight. Because of that, the Azure Dragon's Holy Spirit became unable to attack Li Yunmu. At that moment, the system's voice hastily echoed in his head again. Quick, host, start the final step of congealing.